set? Okay. We're on page, I have my text at the top of page 33. We just finished the last verse of that section. According to what he speaks, the Dharma of still quiescence, basically nirvana, in a manner, in a way that delights living beings. And now we go into the standard verse refrain. I'm just going to read this in English and then start in Chinese with the verse that follows. And probably not say anything about the refrain linking section here because it's identical to the ones we've been through before. So the text continues. Those of you following in Chinese, it's 尔时光明无前世界. At that time, light passed through 1,000 worlds and everywhere illumined 10,000 worlds in the east. It was also like this in the south, west, north, the four intermediate directions, as well as above and below. And Jambudvipas, reaching up to 1 billion ultimate form heavens. All these were clearly revealed or shown in this light. Just as in this place one could see the thus come one, seated on his lotus flower treasury, lions throned the Bodhisattvas, as many as fine motes of dust in 10 Buddha lands, circumambulating him. So too in each of those billions of Jambudvipas, there were billions of thus come ones seated in the same way. Because of the spiritual power of the Buddha, in each of the 10 directions there was a great Bodhisattva, accompanied by Bodhisattvas to the number of fine motes of dust in 10 Buddha lands, who came to the Buddha's place. Their names were Manjushri and others. They came from countries called Golden Colored World and others, and the Buddhas they served were called unmoving wisdom, thus come ones. And at that time, in the presence of all those Buddhas, the voices of Manjushri Bodhisattvas and all those places rang out in unison and spoke this verse or these verses. So finishing up there, those who are following in the Chinese, it's Gu Yu Fo Suo Tong Shi Fa Shang Shuo Si Song Yan. And now we have the actual verse. 法器大悲心，救护诸众生，永出人天中，如是业应受。English of this is produce a mind of great compassion or a heart of great compassion. Or, better translation, you really don't have to do the produce. You can just say, have a greatly compassionate mind. Be greatly compassionate. That's even better. You don't have to, this is so literal. The fa qi, to bring forth great compassion, xin, all of this means is just be greatly compassionate. Save and protect all living beings. Forever leave the multitudes of people and gods. This is the karma that should be done. I'm not so sure why, at least in the English here on that third line, anybody, basically, so be greatly compassionate, save and protect all beings. I don't understand why the infinitive to is there. It's not necessary in the Chinese for sure. So it could probably be just omitted. Forever leave the multitudes of gods and people. This is a karma that should be done. Or you could say, I would leave that 2 out. I just think it's superfluous. Unless anybody else want to weigh in quickly? It's a translator's prerogative to put that infinitive in there. And in English, it doesn't make a great deal of sense. So, as we look at this, we have at that time, and again, what time was this? It could be in the past, it could be in the present, it could be in the future. In this Avatamsaka state, notions of time and space, you could say, are expanded, or they are as they are, and we have trouble with them because we shrink our consciousness down. So it's just saying, at a particular time, at this particular time, in all times, in all places. What you notice here is a shift from the previous verses, I think. It shifts from describing the Buddha's virtues and appearances. If you look at the verses that were listed above, most of them were descriptions of the Buddha, his appearances, the manifestations he takes, crossing over boundless beings, his radiant golden color, and so forth, describing the Buddha. And now, clearly, we're into something you'd have to say is an exhortation. Now, Manjushri's Bodhisattva is speaking this. So he's speaking it to all those who've gathered from these 10 directions, primarily these great Bodhisattvas, and saying, Fa Qi Xin, bring forth, generate, strike up, be greatly compassionate. And this tone continues throughout. These are not just, you could say, instructions, but a clarion call to raise their spirits and to go forth and engage in the practice that Bodhisattvas engage in. And here you have it. Out of great compassion, this oneness with all beings, they then have a corresponding both call and response to protect and save living beings. And I go over this. And further, in doing this, there's a third line here, lead the multitudes of people and gods. In other words, in order to do this well, to do this thoroughly, they have to leave all attachment to other paths of existence. So bodhisattvas are in one of the 10 realms. But in that realm, they are unattached, unbound, and liberated. They are not, you could say, even attached to being bodhisattvas. They are the total embodiment of their vows and conduct right now. They are what they do. They do what they are. There's not a split there. And so it's an encouragement, basically, to leave these realms, not abandon them. We have to be careful, but leave an attached longing or lingering in these realms. So they're meant to be not to retreat back into turning and flowing in the heavens or in the human realm. So remember last week we talked about the different realms of existence, the 25 realms of existence and so forth. That included desire, form, and formless. And this is just another restatement of do not go back into dwelling in those places. It's kind of interesting in Dharma, there isn't always a going forth. And in some ways, it's what leaving home means. You're going forth from the realm of attachments and desires and afflictions, narrow identities, and you're constantly expanding the measure of your heart and mind and your consciousness. And so this is seen as a going forth. And yet, the interesting thing about what this means for bodhisattvas is they go forth, they move, so to speak, out of these realms, but they never abandon these realms. So this is they're there, but they're not caught up in it. This is the everywhere engaged, nowhere attached state of mind that the Huineng, the Sixth Patriarch, mentions. So this is really quite interesting. It's not like they abandon and leave behind and then live in a different realm apart from the gods, animals, hells, and people, but rather they live and exist in a way that is right there in the midst of it and yet tainted by it, not caught up in it, not confused or turned is another word they use. And then the last line is, this is the karma that should be done. This is how bodhisattvas should conduct themselves. So a little bit on this, and maybe just suggestions of how we might translate this. Here, for me, one of the key lines is this jiu hu. This is the hu of hufa, right? Is that right? Hufa. Yeah, hufa to hu. Yeah, so hufa means dharma protector. Jiu, according to my limited understanding in Chinese, means to save. It can mean to save, but it means also to preserve and to rescue. And I like better prevent from ill, prevent from harm. Help out, in a more colloquial sense. The reason I would not translate this as it is, save and let's see what it is here. Let's take a look. Yeah, I wouldn't use save, and the reason is there's nothing wrong with the word save, but in the Western sense of what we're translating this into English, and largely a lot of the English-speaking world, historically, philosophically, spiritually, has been colored by and infused with a Judeo-Christian worldview. And so the word save doesn't have just a neutral connotation, to me, coming up through that tradition, but has a very strong theological, eschatological meaning. Just to be short, it talks about an eternal spiritual deliverance, save or salvation in the Western sense. Now, we're not talking about economics here, save your money. We're talking about this other meaning of save. So it's an eternal spiritual deliverance, ever and forever. And again, from the Buddhist point of view, there is no such thing as eternal stopping or dwelling. There's just continuousness. Secondly, what you're saved from here is the wrath of God and damnation for your sins. And again, this save from the wrath of the Buddha or the wrath of the enlightened beings just doesn't exist in Buddhism. And sins is not exactly what is going on here in the sense of cause and effect from a Buddhist sense. Furthermore, in the save or the salvation motif that's recurring, only the divine being, God, can remove the sin and deliver from sin's penalty in this model. And clearly, that's not what Buddhism, the Buddha is not a God who has the power to remove karma and deliver us from karma's retributions. And specifically, more in the Christian sense, it's not just God, but it's Jesus, whose death on the cross and subsequent resurrection, I'm just giving you some Christian theology here, that achieved our salvation. In other words, there was other agency that did it for people. And so the idea is, if you simply believe and accept this, you are in the space of being saved. And it's very interesting because, at least as I understand these scriptures, it's a grace, or it's a gracious, undeserved gift of God, and it's only available through faith in Jesus. So it's really a faith-based justification, and it's another power, liberation or salvation. And this is very different from Buddhism, especially psychologically. I've said this many times, and I'll say it again from the Dhammapada. In Buddhism, there's a very clear statement. No one saves you but yourselves. No one can and no one may. You yourself must walk the path. Buddhas only show the way. So the walking of the path is the liberating, saving mechanism. And that's something you do by cultivating precepts, samadhi, and wisdom, repenting and renewing, becoming the best person you can. And in fact, in the Buddhist tradition, when your humanity, when your humanness reaches its accomplishment, chung, to be, or you could say zhi, like zhiren in the Taoist thing, when you reach the extreme, you automatically become Buddha. It's a non-dual continuum from the human to Buddha. There's no split. And so the Buddha cannot do the saving because there is no difference between the human and Buddha along this continuum. That's psychologically very different. Therefore, in this thing, to use the word save, it would be, the emphasis should be on your own cultivation, on your own practice, on your own transformation that you're going through as a person, becoming a better and better person till ultimately that humanity turns into Buddha. My teacher had an expression, when the path of being a person is walked to the ultimate, Buddhahood accomplishes itself. So in this you have a dualistic God and the Jesus, Son of God, who are the only way, effectively, that you can reach salvation. And it is not something even you can ask for, but it's something that's given as a gift rather than something you, quote, even earn. So this changes the whole psychology away from deeply sort of cultivating yourself and transforming yourself in a bittersweet way to an external looking. And I think this is, to some extent, although this is not, Hui Neng wasn't dealing with this theology, what he meant by do not look outside. Do not look outside your own nature for the end of suffering and for liberation and so forth. So that's why I would use something like cherish and protect as an alternative here for the verse. Be greatly compassionate. Cherish and protect all living beings. Now you can use it as save, cherish and protect, or you can just use it as protect or cherish. I don't think you have to necessarily, my understanding, not necessarily do you have to use both, right? Isn't jiuhu can be a single English expression?
Yeah, could be.
Okay, doesn't necessarily have to be two, you render them two characters.
Yeah, particularly, it's kind of like a phrases of the 5 characters, right? Sometimes they have to come up with.
Drop your mask so I can understand, sorry.
Yeah, because there's a parallel structure of the 5 words, right? Each line is 5 words, 5 words, 5 words. So sometimes they have to come up with something to match the format.
So they're trying in the English to come up with a match to the 5 characters on the other side.
Sometimes, yeah.
Sometimes, right. In this particular case, so I think it's important to either change save to cherish and protect, or just say protect living beings because of the philosophical meaning, not lyrically. There's no way that I know of, so in all the time we've been working with the Chinese, that we get the same lyrical rhythms of the Chinese verse. It just, I don't know what Shakespeare looks like translated into Chinese, but I'm sure it doesn't have the same, pentameter and the same, like the sonnets. When I behold by time's fell hand to face the which proud cost of outborn, age. When I sometimes lofty towers see down raised, or brass eternal slave to mortal rage. You feel the rhythm of that? Now that in Chinese, translated, I don't think we'll be able to capture it. But that's just and I don't know Polish. When you translate this into Polish, you're facing the same thing, right?
But Shakespeare is pretty good in Polish.
Huh?
Shakespeare is pretty good in Polish.
Shakespeare is?
Shakespeare is pretty good in Polish.
Shakespeare is good in Polish. Okay.
Of course,
Pretty good.
you never can be close to.
Well, what about the Chinese, though?
This is a different story.
Well, I'm guessing from my take, okay, so you're not, quote, American, like me. You're Polish. But isn't save in your background have the same connotation, save and salvation?
Of course, I'm very, how to say, I don't relate to this world. It has a lot of baggage in it.
Okay. Basically, people who can't hear him online, he's saying for him, coming from a Polish tradition, which is within that Judeo-Christian background, save has a lot of baggage with it. Okay, so the other thing to remember here is, and this is, people do this, they conflate Buddhas and Bodhisattvas as saviors. It's very interesting. Even though that is clearly not what the text is saying, there's something in our psyche that wants to be taken care of, almost paternally or maternally. And so we translate these texts as these all-powerful agents of change and moreover of creation and of destiny. In other words, we transfer to them all our fears and longings and insecurities about taking care of ourselves and thrust it onto these beings to be. And in fact, the Buddha or the Bodhisattvas are not creators. They don't create the world. They don't control our destiny. And they don't save us. More you see words like they're guides, they're mentors. I like map makers. They make maps. They're advisors. They're exemplars. All of these connotations, but all of this is a pedagogical exchange that's going on. It's not picking up and saving, but rather inspiring, guiding, showing. I think I would move towards their action then, what they do. They're not just passive though. They don't just say, save yourself or take care of yourself. Obviously, you can see they're really busy. The last line, this is the karma that should be done. This is work. So I would say more like the verbs that might apply here is they intervene. They intervene, skillfully intervene into human behavior. They reorient in the way that they talk, in the metaphors they use, in the way that they live. They cause us to constantly re-examine and re-look at things from a different paradigm, from a different light. They blow whistles. That's another image I have. They light lamps. They hit on foghorns. They're lighthouses. All of these metaphors, I think, even when I'm backpacking, one of the things you do when you're crossing a wilderness, you leave cairns. You build cairns, which are interesting piles of rocks on top of one another. And these become markers for people who are coming after. You do not save those people. All you do is simply help mark out a trail that they too will follow. So this is how I see the action and engagement of bodhisattvas in this process of cultivation. They aren't passive. They aren't benign. They aren't sort of just withdrawing from the world and doing nothing. On the other hand, they aren't overestimating their abilities. And the reason they're not overestimating their abilities is because in the nature of things, they cannot do what we want them to do. They cannot literally save us. I mean, that's why you have these wonderful expressions in Buddhism. So you eat to get your fill. Nobody else does that for you. You wear clothes to keep out the cold. Nobody else can wear clothes for you. You sleep to get rest. Nobody can sleep for you. And nobody can, quote, save you in the same way. So it just doesn't work in the way of things that somebody steps in and does this. So to some extent, this is a little unsettling because it makes us feel possibly vulnerable, a little exposed, a little unsure. On the other hand, it can be very empowering because it puts this radical responsibility right into your own hands and a corresponding radical freedom that goes with it. But you can't have one without the other. If you want this taste of liberation, this taste of autonomy, of being free from klesha, then there has to be the responsibility to do that. I think too, we could look at these signposts or these markers, we could call them, that are the work of bodhisattvas as the actual creation of text, both in memorization of text, but in the writing down and the translation of text. They are in fact doing this work. They are creating these markers, these transformative indices pointing to us. And I would say even in the icons, for example, we got 3 wonderful icons here from probably the Ming on the altar here. When people come in, myself included, the first time they were here, I went and took a look at them and I was moved. I was moved and inspired. These are wooden statues, but there is something about the quality and the vibe that comes off, and I'm not just talking aesthetically, like they're well done. There's some energy and vibe that comes the way they are proportioned and the spirit that they convey. I sat in the back there for 45 minutes and didn't move, just looking at them. I don't usually do that. Not bowing, just looking at them and being sort of bathed and enraptured by that. That was a marker, and it wasn't a marker to necessarily worship them. It was almost like, how come I'm not like that? How come I don't have that energy? And the idea was you could. And it's almost like somebody makes those to remind us, makes these icons to remind us that this is something that's within our potential. I think also these markers or these lamps or these foghorns are the sounds, the devotions, the chanting, the instruments, the translations. The temple itself is like a lighthouse in the sea of birth and death. And the scrolls, the hanging scrolls, the statuary, and probably most importantly, according to the Avatamsaka, the actual physical embodiment of an individual who, quote, manifest body shwofa, speak dharma. What's the manifest again? It's something, shan shwofa. What is it? Arshwan shwofa? Jian. Jian. Jian.
出现的现 ，X I
jian
现
jian shan shwofa.
现
Huh?
现
Shen.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, Shen. Even with the mask off, my ears are getting old. Yes, and thank you all for reminding me that it was my birthday yesterday, and you sent nice greetings and whatnot. And I had to think, wow, time has flown all these years, and I'm sort of still here, but wow. Anyhow, so Shen, Shun, Shuofa, literally embody the teaching, become Dharma. We just had this wonderful essay we're looking at from Ajahn Chah, the Thai forest monk, called Taste of Freedom, which was actually a translation of Vimutti Rasa in Pali. And in it, he says, when you cultivate, you become the Dharma becomes you. They're not two different things. It's not like the Dharma's here and you're here. You actually are Dharma. You have disappeared, and all that's left is a person of the way with no mind. This is really interesting. So here, the idea is that embodiment is the highest form of cherishing and protecting. Because you're literally giving physical, embodied, tactile inspiration to people that they can actually become. And this is the importance of the living tradition. The scriptures, the text, the icons are all very important. They inspire, they touch us. But unless you see it embodied directly in a teacher or a Dharma friend, it's really hard to imagine you could be that, you could do that. But when you see that done, there's a kind of interesting challenge and inspiration simultaneously. Why can't I do that? That can be done. So I think this is the importance of that. I think what happens here is then you're encouraging, you're modeling, you're creating, and this I think is very important, to create and sustain conditions for understanding and awakening. So what it means to cherish and protect It means you create and sustain conditions for understanding. If no one saves you but yourself, no one can, no one may, then the conditions, the environment that make that possible, that facilitate that, really important. Shila, the precepts, protecting the precepts, giving the precepts, embodying the precepts, is creating those conditions. Meditation retreats, both literal and figurative, retreating from that which is unwholesome, retreating from deviant wrong livelihood, retreating from your greed, anger, and stupidity. These kinds of retreats. That creates the conditions that make understanding and awakening possible for yourself, of course, but even for others, because it shows it can be done. If I can get a handle on my temper and my arrogance and really get it under control, it's got to be inspiring for anybody else who's wrestling with that. Same with your drugs and your alcohol and all your other addictions. Just simply by precepting them, retreating from them, you create a bodhimanda energy. You create a little pure land within which people feel conditions and inspiration to cultivate. This is true then of sustaining by giving offerings. For example, in the monastic life, people give food and bedding and medicine and clothing to the monastics to help them have the conditions for cultivation. That giving also creates the conditions on their part for transformation by reducing selfishness and ego. So probably along these lines, I would say just being a good Dharma friend is probably one of the best conditions for supporting people's cultivation. Having friendship and Dharma. So this cherish and protect, I think, is the idea of almost like a shield that you have, or I would say the modern version is Kevlar. You have a Kevlar vest. The Shurangama uses the idea of a white canopy, which is interesting, like an umbrella, that cherishes and protects. And so what you're trying to do both in your personal, really existential life, being the best possible person you can, creates an ambient sort of umbrella, a chi, an energy. Reciting, memorizing things like the Shurangama Sutra and a mantra also bring another dimension to that maybe is not immediately visible to you, but creates a white canopy under which one has shade from the darkness and the afflictions and so forth. So mantras in themselves, memorizing, reciting mantras, is creating these markers, these conditions for understanding. Okay, any questions on that so far? So I would just recommend generally getting rid of save for all these reasons we just talked about. Questions, thoughts? Okay.
I can't quite catch exactly, but like how to actually accurately ask the question, but just like but something like, because actually after I come here to
After what?
After I came here to this retreat.
Yes.
There's we all experience, this difference between Western culture and Eastern culture. Somehow, like, I found that in the Western culture, at least in the modern context, it just makes sense, to actually tap into this inherent wisdom, because it might be due to the theological context. The Western has gone through.
Has what?
Has gone through the theological struggle, the salvation. Maybe it's due to that background, but also as I was reflecting on my own Eastern culture, I'm just trying to search where this inherent wisdom is embedded in the culture itself. It sounds like sometimes I feel like, like a Guanyin in Eastern culture, I don't know how it actually becomes a role of savior, but not in the theological sense.
Right.
So I was trying to see.
So basically your question is, culture is one of those influencing factors in how we think and see and perceive. And I was bringing up tonight the idea that save and salvation is very strongly baggaged in the Western Judeo-Christian side. Now, but the important thing to stress here is I think it's primarily psychological and not cultural. In other words, one way of looking at, say, autonomy, freedom, obedience, salvation, sin, redemption, all of these concepts, is to say they are universals almost throughout all cultures. The difference is a degree of intensity rather than kind. When I first went to Asia, on my first trip to Asia as a Buddhist monk, was expecting to find all this zili, self-cultivation, versus tali and mishin and superstition. Oh no, I read the text here, it's not there, it's wonderful. I was overwhelmed by the amount of superstition and savior salvation thing that was going on. It's like, well, wait a minute. So this isn't just a Judeo-Christian phenomenon. It exists right within here. And the same thing, you can look at this culture and say there's philosophers and teachings that really do stress self-cultivation. And the fact, someone like Emerson, who basically says we are gods in shards, we are broken gods. We have all that potential for self-realization. So the transcendentalist movement, or even the pragmatic philosophical movement in the West, has a very strong correlation of self-power, self-cultivation, and that the divine is immanent within the human and not outside. So I think a more effective way of looking at this is these sort of major themes: individualism versus group, or filial versus independent, disconnect, blah blah blah. However you want to make these major themes, they exist across. It's just a question of degree, to what extent they are the dominant as opposed to the subservient elements of a culture. And I think generally you could say there's a rugged individualism, say, within this, but there's also, look at America in terms, it has more cults and groupie phenomena where people just give up their individualism and go hook, line, and sinker into some weird religious group, right up to the present now. And then you would say, well, no, this is supposed to be Asian groupism, social life. No. And then you have individuals, rugged individuals throughout even our text here. Hui Neng and Han Shan and Xu Yin are breaking with the norms. So I think it's not a question if it's here and not there, or there and not here, but it's a question of degree. And it could be also over time it shifts and changes. It's not like it's the same forever. So I think that's a better way to look at it. But the only reason I was saying here is because this has, right now as we talk, you just turn on the television, you're constantly told you're going to be saved, salvation, and everybody who runs for president has to make the statement that they've been, saved, or there's a word that they use. What's that word that?
Born again?
Born again, yeah. These kind of ideas, it's true. They may or may not have been born again. I don't know. Politicians talk out of both sides of their mouth, but they feel it's important to make these statements because they're in a culture where this is held up to be normative, to have these kinds, and they can get an identity base that's bigger. I don't think if you're running for a position, in China or Taiwan, you have to say you're born again, but you do here. But you might have to say something else there. You might have to go to your parents' shrine and sweep the graves and make sure you go through those. These things can be I don't mean to put them down, they can be effective tools for understanding liberation, but more often they become blind conventions that we buy into that cover over this liberating critical inquiry impulse that's important for one to become enlightened. Yeah. Okay, good question. Oh, heck, we're out of time. Okay, well, that's okay. I'll just say tonight a little bit about this, and then maybe I'll use next week is our last class. Yeah, next week. So maybe next week I'll go into this more. I want to go into the idea of karma. Now you see it in this line here is 如是业因作. Okay, 如是 in this way like this, 业, which is then translated as karma, should 做, do an act. Okay? This is the karma that should be done as a translation. Just to get us started tonight, I will say, in my experience, karma, along with nirvana and dukkha and suffering, are three major central concepts to this tradition that are widely misunderstood. Not only by, quote, outsiders, but within Buddhist circles and communities themselves. And it bears looking at this a little more. And I'm not, quote, the expert or even a expert, but as I saw this was so central, I've over the years wrestled with what does this mean? And I would say, first of all, to understand, it's a karmic-centered view, world, that is being presented to us in the text. And again, that is not, go back to the Judeo-Christian, that is not a karmic-centered worldview. Okay? So this is a very different worldview. One of the defining and I would say the other concept to add is no self, anatta, and emptiness. Now we got 5 possible misunderstood terms. But this one, here, generally, my understanding, again, help me out in the Chinese, it has 2 distinct meanings. And I'm making a point here, although they're distinct, they might both apply here in this verse. One is the modern everyday use of ye, which is a practice, an endeavor, an activity, a conduct. It can be associated with career, a business specialty. It's used in a line of business, industry, undertaking, occupation, job, employment, even your school studies. Okay? You do a startup company, it could be a ye. That's the ordinary sort of everyday use of that. In Buddhism, it has another very specific meaning. And this has to do with intentional actions that carry moral energy, carry moral implications to them, that result in returns or effects that guide and shape our lives. So it's not just an activity or a career thing you do, but it's a intentional, volitional act of body, speech, and mind that correspondingly results in, almost inescapably, inexorably results in, certain kinds of effects and returns. This is the key in terms of cultivation, is to understand this mechanism. Because it's this mechanism, this law of cause and effect, if you will, or this energy of cause and effect, that both ties us in knots and at the same time is the same mechanism that unties the knots. So if we're talking about, we go back and say, well, nobody's saving you. You're doing it yourself. How are you doing it? You don't do it by just exerting energy. You don't do it by mortifying yourself and doing Spartan cultivation. You do it through insightfully understanding this, how it works, and then mastering it. And this means, therefore, you are becoming more and more aware of the effects that your speech has, your thoughts have, and your actions have. And those 3 are very closely related. So this is where meditation or mindfulness takes on a whole new meaning here. Mindfulness is the mechanism, not external salvation. Mindfulness is the mechanism to free us from the entanglements and obstacles generated by unexamined, unmindful, unskillful actions, words, deeds, thoughts, and emotions, and so forth. So this is why, to look at karma here, and I'll just make one gloss tonight. Generally, when I heard the idea of karma, as a non-Buddhist, and now I will say, as I hear it as a Buddhist in many places, karma to a lot of people is the bad stuff that hits you. You know, it's like, oh, you had it coming. It's your karma. It's what befalls. Do you know the language befalls? Falls upon. Rain falls, it befalls, it falls upon. So karma generally, even in some Buddhist circles, is primarily understood as what befalls us. I'm going to suggest that a much more constructive way is to look at it as what begets. Not what befalls, what begets. What starts, what incites, what puts into motion. And if you look at it that way, you move it away from passive either acceptance or disappointment at what befalls to a kind of active, responsible concern with begetting. And that's why we have the famous expression, ordinary people, whether they're Buddhist or not, pay attention to effects, but not to the begetting. Bodhisattvas pay attention to the begetting and not worry about the befalling. I'm doing a re-rendering here. So we're out of time tonight. Next week I try to go into this a lot more, share with you some text and whatnot. But I think, and it's a good way to end the semester here, is to really spend some time. Because in my classes and whatnot, some of the students have said, we go through 4 semesters here, we never really look closely at this key concept of karma. It's just presumed that we understand it, or it's a given. But as I look at it over a long period of time, I realize it's not clearly understood. There's a lot of misconceptions concerning karma. So next week, our last class, we'll look into that a little more. Any questions on that?
We have a question online.
Okay.
So with regards to the self-power, who is the self that is empowered?
It's you. It be you. So I think behind this question is the idea of the no self. No self is a result of self-cultivation. No self is a result of doing the self-power to the ultimate. In other words, you cultivate this here and now self, this ordinary self, and by cultivating, refining it, that using the power of that self to cultivate it, the self vanishes, and what's left is an enlightened being. So that's the answer. That's what it means in the Avatamsaka. Truth and falseness interlink and mingle. Within the ordinary mind, one finds Buddha mind. Within the ordinary person, cultivated through self-power, working on the conventional ordinary self, that is transformed into the no self. And the no self is not the absence of a being, it's a person without a self. A Buddha or a Bodhisattva is a non-self being. So that self is, you start with the ordinary at hand. You start with your own greed, anger, stupidity, and afflictions, and you rub and you polish and you remove and you straighten out. And in that process of that self-power, working on it, that false self, the conditioned self, starts to fade away. And what's left is then true self, one of the 4 virtues of nirvana. I hope that was sort of the direction it's going, because if you say there is no self, then you're stuck and just say, well, there's no cultivation, and if there's no cultivation, there's no deliverance, and then we're back into a fatal nihilistic thing here. Of course there's a self. Is it confused and tied in knots? Duh. But that's the only ground you have to work on. All Buddhas and Bodhisattvas come from confused selves. They don't end there, but that's where they start. Hence, the beginning. Paying attention to the beginning. Okay, anything else? Any announcements? Are somebody else going to share tonight? Maybe you want to.
Last time when I was talking, I took the process of farewell to my grandma. So it was close to me, and it's something what is close to my heart, so I maybe want to share also a few reflections around this topic. Especially on maybe on the light and as reflecting of living home, of living family, which impact myself, impact her in terms of our relationship, kind of reoriented or changed. I can say even maybe deeper, kind of our spiritual connection, and prepare myself to face the time that someone who was very important in my life, I have to witness how he's passing. And I trust that also the choices that I made also have some impact or influence on her. So it was to leave here, to come to California and kind of follow my spiritual journey. One of the most difficult part was to say to my grandma, I'm leaving and I don't know when I will return. Finally, I did it, but when I realized that kind of her well-being, her wishes for her to be good, be safe, become a kind of a spiritual fuel for my practice here. So ironically, she was present almost every moment or very often, especially when transfer married. So we were physically distant, but spiritually close, I can say, to some extent. And from this last almost 9 years I'm here, I have a chance to see her just a few times. First, when I was a layman, I have a surgery in Poland, and back surgery, and for almost 5 months, I was like a baby, and she was as a nurse for myself, very kind and compassionate. Next time I came as a bhikshu, just after ordination, to receive my green card. And I remember the first time I came in my robes, she looked at me, "You look good," she says. But behind these words, I'm feeling happy that you follow your path. I received this message in this way. Every day, I spent almost 3 weeks with my alms bowl. I came to her house, and ironically, she didn't just feed her grandson, but also make an offering to the Sangha member, to Bhikshu, Buddhist monk, and to Sangha of 10 Directions. One old 83 years old woman, Catholic, who lives in Białystok, northeast part of Poland. Next time I have a short opportunity to be with her, maybe 2 hours. I mentioned, I think, last time, this conversation is actually recorded. I have an opportunity to ask her important questions. For what I can learn from you, Grandma. You're 88 old at the time, Grandma. Ask her about her prayers, what she learned from her mother, and ask her, what do you think? What is the most important for your perspective, for younger generation? What you learned from your entire life? And she, without any thinking, says, love. Love is the most important. And later she says, she didn't go very much to romantic love, but ability to deeply communicate with each other, and says, I have a lot of resistance and couldn't open my heart as I could. And it was a part of kind of a little bit repentance, I can say. And at the time also, we have a chance to talk about that. And she says, I think I don't worry about it. I don't fear. I think I'm ready. It was kind of surprising me that how openly she could talk about this topic. And the last time, it was a month ago, it was her last days. I was in hospital next to her bed, 15 minutes or 20 we have with each other. Half of it was silence and kind of a, spiritual presence, what we kind of share with each other. I chant some mantras and ask her that, are you ready? She says yes. And it was a kind of another spiritual reconnection, but also kind of a sense of let go, what I heard from her. And the seeds kind of arose in my heart as well. And like sharing this story, I a little bit talk about this in the morning, that a day ago, I have a dream. She came in my dream to myself, and it was her funeral ceremony. You know, many people around, I was there, a little bit sad, kind of grieving, and I step aside. I see my grandma appear. She looks like maybe 20, 30 years younger, with kind of black hair. Look at me, and, don't worry, I'm happy, I'm very happy. Everything is okay with me. And I have this kind of feeling behind the words that she's in the safe place. Interestingly, the next day we have kind of a conversation class with Doug Powers, who read to us a commentary to Avatamsaka Sutra from 10 Grounds, when Master Hua was talking about the meaning of the dreams. He says that some of them can be vivid, some very clear, and even be a quote-unquote prediction of events that's going to happen in the future, or some of them can be a sort of a teaching, what can be received. It was kind of coincidence. Of course, I don't know this was any prediction from myself what this dream was happen, but it gave me a kind of sense of peace in my heart, and knowing that I think that my grandma is going in good direction, and we are still connected, and I still can spiritually support her, and but at the same time make a peace. What's happened? What has happened is natural thing, and I hope that she's in a good place. And at the same time, I again want to express my gratitude. I know many people support myself and her and send the prayers, dedication merits, and so forth. So it's very important to her and important for me. So that's my sharing for today.
Announcement, are you starting your session tomorrow?
Yes, so tomorrow we have starting 3 days of Amitabha session. At 8 a.m. it will be transmission of 8 precepts. This will be online event. 8 a.m. is transmission of 8 precepts. From 9 a.m. to 10th we will recite the Buddha's name, and at noon we'll have 30 minutes recitation, and from 2 to 3:30, so be from Saturday to Monday. You can check on our website. Also, those who want to dedicate their practice, this is a chance to fill out the form and set up the paiways, the dedication merit plaques, and kind of in this way support the people who want to for the practice. And tomorrow also in the evening, Monk Heng Sure will lecture on Avatamsaka Sutra at 7:30, like every week. And Jinchuan, anything else we have to?
Just because you take the precepts online doesn't mean you only hold them online. You have to hold them offline too. Just to be clear about this, like, well, I'm going to take online precepts and all I have to do is hold them while I'm online. No.
So this is our, of course, we have our daily practices starting at 4 a.m., morning ceremony, meditation, 3 steps, 1 bow. This is the morning kind of chunk of practice. Noon at 12 to 12:30, we recite Amitabha's name or Guanyin name. Evening ceremony and lectures as well in the evening. So if you wish, you can join us.
Okay.
Next week's the last class there, right? Next week's the last class.
Yeah, Marty mentioned that this is the last class. This is
You must have been sleeping when I said it. That's okay.
next week will be
Next
there.
week's the last class for this semester, and
Yeah.
we'll pick it up again in January.
Our minds are one and radiant with light. Share the fruits of peace with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may our minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light break the darkness of our endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of painters into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise. Bowing respect to the triple jewels.